Hello and welcome to another episode of the ICC Academy Livecast, a new podcast series where we take a deeper dive into global business trends and ideas. I'm your host, Thomas Paris, and in this episode, we will learn more about smart contracts, their integration with blockchain technology, and what this will mean for the future of trade. Our special guest today is Dorjee Sun, Chief Executive Officer at Perlin.net. So before we get started, tell us a little bit about your background and your role at Perlin.
Sure. So I kind of came to blockchain and to trade later in my career. So I started my first software company on campus while I was at university. And, we were really fortunate. I think timing, it's better to be lucky than good in a lot of cases. So I was pretty motivated and we ended up starting a few different software companies. A couple of them got acquired. And that from there, I found my way into my quarter life crisis. So if there are any people out there currently contemplating looking at their office and wondering, is this where I'm supposed to be for the next 10 years? I was absolutely in that space in my late 20s. And that was when I really came into, I guess, what you'd call social entrepreneurship. So how do you marry meaning with money? And that was when we started getting into carbon credits. So we started doing what I still believe is the most important job in the world, which is conservation of natural habitat, conservation of forests. And the way we were funding that was through carbon credits. So if you Google it later on, we ended up raising a facility to protect forests over $400 million, use those carbon credits to then sell to emitters. And we had basically this really fantastic mechanism to conserve, but also allow for, growth and decarbonizing of the economy. What was interesting then was we were really reliant on governments and government policy. So we were essentially relying on either the US government to pass Waxman-Markey, which was a bill that would provide carbon offset purchases, or, post-Kyoto or Paris or Copenhagen or any of the slew of different subnational regimes, and none of them really came through. So none of them really ended up including carbon from forests. And I was so disappointed in 2013, 2014. I still remember looking at all of these government mandated, programs and just thinking how much they sucked, basically.
Right.
And so that was when I kind of looked at, okay, so you've got what potentially could be argued as peak centralization. So you've got in the kind of before the GFC, the UN, the WTO, the multilateral organizations really gaining power. And it just made me start looking at decentralized technologies. So that was when I started investing into Bitcoin, started investing into different types of cryptocurrencies and different types of decentralized technologies, just because the concept of having a consensus be able to be reached without a central authority was so fascinating. What would civilization look like if we didn't need to have a centralized government doing everything? And so that's really kind of how we ended up being in Perlin and being in this space where we're building out public ledger. We were partnering with the ICC. And what's fascinating is it's kind of marrying decentralized technologies with the need for centralized rule setting and centralized understanding and governance.
Right. So it's been an eclectic road leading all the way up to Perlin. My question was, if we take one step back away from Perlin, taking more a broader look at blockchain and distributed ledger technology as a whole, what does the industry look like today in 2019?
So it's incredibly early.
Right.
So it still is, the technology is evolving. It's still clunky. It's not user friendly. If you were to think about sort of comparables, think about before the Apple iPhone, you had the Newton. You had Palm Pilots, and it's no different from that. But what's absolutely clear is that, the friction that's being created by regulations and by governance, and when you look at the centralized authorities, banks, their requirements for KYC, AML, Basel IV, you're just going to have an increasing higher cost for centralized authorities to be able to comply. And that's where I see a massive opportunity for decentralized technologies. I mean, we haven't even gotten into trade yet, but just think about the fact that we are in 2019, still using hundreds of pages of documents just to ship containers.
Right.
In a world where everyone has, apps and mobile phones, uses email, SMS, WhatsApp, You can communicate, create a group, coordinate, function. But why do we still use thousands of pages of paper? Still have all those backroom facilities where you've got literally 100 people matching word for word and dot for dot these pages. So just coming back to answer your question, we're very early. As with all tipping points or hype curves, you have a much slower rate of adoption initially, then it accelerates tremendously, and then it kind of flattens out as you get, tipping points. And they always say it's faster in the short term, but then its impact is greater in the long term. So that's where I see we're at. We're still a smaller group of true believers, but I think the tipping point is going to be occurring in 2020, 2021. Right.
So how many people are with Perlin now?
So we've got about 30 people.
Okay.
We have the main head office is in Singapore, and we have offices in China, Kiev, so Ukraine. We have people in Romania. We have people in the US. So it's a you need a certain type of talent to kind of build what we're building. So right. We have to go where the talent is.
Of course, yeah. And the very nature of what it is that you're building, something that is decentralized, is sort of mirrored in the way that you are compiling that your team from all around the world are trying to get the best people on board. Yeah, so that's interesting. So you mentioned trade in the beginning, and we'll get back to Perlin and what it is that you guys are doing, specifically on the products that you offer. But on the trade side, when we take a look at the supply chain today, how things are being done, you mentioned the number of documents that are being circulated now for a single transaction. In your view, with the tools that you guys are working on, how can we tie together distributed ledgers, the ICC tools like the Incoterms rules, as well as cryptocurrency, and trying to create something that is a homogenized, consolidated approach to trade?
Yeah, so just first point, if you think about, say, Facebook. Right. So Facebook has introduced their cryptocurrency concept. It's Libra.
Yep.
I mean, if you just think about it, right now, we were just in Brazil for the World Chambers Conference, and it was just phenomenal. The minister stood up and said 99% of Brazilian economy is micro and small to medium-sized businesses, and yet only 1% is exports, from SMEs. And you think about all the barriers. You need a bill of lading, letter of credit. You need to, have certificates of origin, phyto certificates. You've got all of this documentation and work, and does a small business that's exporting coffee, have the human capital or the ability to do that.
Right.
Now think about Facebook. What if they could literally send a package of whatever it is that they're sending, have that seamlessly and easily contracted so that, and again, you could use an Incoterm, is it FOB, is it CIF, however it is, the package gets tracked on whatever shipping methodology, and then they self-execute. So they get paid in Facebook, Libra, coin through their Messenger or WhatsApp. I mean, surely that is a world that we're heading towards. So one, from the democratizing of access for trade for these types of organizations, smaller businesses, micro SMEs, that's one. Two, coming back to your question, Incoterms, even the idea of, sales agreements, the negotiable, the amount of variation in that, having to go to a bank to set up a letter of credit, like all of these different steps are just more and more barriers for small to medium-sized businesses. So the world that we see especially in Perlin and our network is, one, it's already happening. Decentralized technologies simply provide more efficiency. So that's why Singapore government is building their national trade platform. They're building trade trust. We've got Dubai, we've got Hong Kong, we've got all these governments investing in this. Those ledgers will need to be audited because they're private ledgers. And that's where we see the ICC's role. So ICC, in partnership with the ICC, we're building public ledger. And the public ledger simply is a way of, all of the headers and all of the information on the private ledgers being hashed and put into the public ledger, just to show that there's no manipulation, right. But all privacy is still contained. And then the whole point of smart contracts is they sit on top of the blockchain. And when this happens, that happens. So the idea really is, if you have satellite companies, so there's new satellite companies, 80 plus satellites in nano space tracking all of the ships. This is one of the companies, Spire. So if you can track companies, track containers, if you've got sensors, so already there are APIs tracking these containers, then you can have self-executing contracts, which essentially make them smart. where payment can be, so whether it's an e-bill of lading or like a e-letter of credit
Right.
or a cryptocurrency, they can settle. And so that's when I think you're starting to reduce the need for couriers, for surveyors, for freight forwarders, for a lot of the human intervention that slows down trade and makes it more costly and time inefficient.
So do we already have small and medium-sized enterprises who are using smart contracts in their business model now?
So in terms of trade, no one has built anything yet that's functional. Well, there are a few pilots, but certainly not small to medium-sized businesses.
Right.
So coming back, I think the next steps, if you were to ask me, how is the next 5 years going to unfold? First of all, as is always the case, you have a nucleus of talented people very motivated to build out whatever the future is. And I think you've got that in the decentralized community. You've got these, and as you always see, it's generational. So the generation of software architects and the technologists that we're working with, are in their 20s. They're very young, they're motivated, they run open source platforms, they have thousands of software engineers all working with them. So from Perlin's perspective, first of all, this is a bit more detailed technically than perhaps is necessary, but we're what we call leaderless proof of stake. So what that means is rather than have a small committee or a small set of delegates making decisions, it's a much broader leaderless proof of stake, meaning people stake to show proof of consensus.
Right.
And rather than using huge amounts of electricity, which has often been seen as a barrier, like Bitcoin, we do not use huge amounts of compute or huge amounts of energy.
Right.
So the first thing is we've built what we believe is a very democratic, so anyone can be a staker. So it's not just a small group of delegates or a committee. Anyone can do it. It's leaderless. So ideally we'll have any citizen, any person and the way we've designed it is it's low computing. So it's the lightest computing requirement to be a staker. So, 512 megabytes of RAM, it's a very easy to comply with type of device. And so the second component of it is you can build the smart contracts, not in a new language. So with Ethereum, you have to learn a new programming language in order to code.
Yeah.
Correct? It's not as accessible. So, estimates are that there's only 30 to 50,000 people equipped with the ability to program the smart contracts in Ethereum. So we've gone for WebAssembly languages, so Rust and JavaScript and eventually Go, as opposed to Solidity. So these are just some of the benefits of the underlying technology platform. Then moving up the stack, we've also started building, what they call apps, but decentralized apps. So they're built on the decentralized ledger. So we call them dApps. The first one was supply chain traceability. So we've already put that out there. If you check out followourfiber.com, it traces rayon from seedling all the way through to production. And you can scan the barcode and see on the blockchain, okay, this is where my bale of rayon, my viscose came from. And you can see where the plantation was, where the mill was, where the seedling was grown, all the whole supply chain. So this is just an immutable way that it's proving that it's not, say, for example, if I'm a centralized authority, do you trust me? Like, how do you know whether or not I've not manipulated where I got the fish, where I caught the fish, where I shipped the fish from? How do I show, well, okay, this was the point that the fish was caught. It is now on an immutable ledger run by, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. And then this is the data which shows that it was shipped from there to there. The sensor has been verified to show that the fish has not been frozen 10 times and unfrozen, has not been, in some way, that provenance chain has not been broken or manipulated or changed. Right. So that's just an example of one of the dApps on top of the blockchain. Another example, and this is where the smart incos and the trade comes in. And apologies, it was I'm just trying to give you examples of how.
That's what we're looking for.
Exactly. Well, hopefully listeners will understand what the significance is. But now if you think about, let's just say we've got a fish on the blockchain that's been caught by an Indonesian fisherman. And he shows that it's very fresh. Like as soon as he catches it, he puts in a sensor which shows that it was caught at this place, at this location, timestamp on the blockchain, GPS. Then he gets to port, and instead of it going through middlemen and warehouses and frozen and unfrozen, you can see that the time from boat to plane. Let's just say that he puts it onto, an dry ice pack and then goes straight to Singapore on, Singapore Airlines, one of the cargo parts.
Right.
It would just be fascinating to say that, okay, wow, this is literally same day fish caught, and then you potentially get a premium for that. And then let's just say it's paid in Libra, like on Facebook coin, because Indonesia is the world's second biggest population using Facebook. So suddenly you can kind of see how the actual technology elements of a consumer platform, which has a wide reach, could be applied in trade. So just coming back, this does not exist today. This is what we're building. What we've built, and anyone out there who's a developer, please go check out Perlin.net. We have a whole bunch of developer repositories. Our GitHub, it's open source. The testnet is live. We'll finish with all the feedback. We'll do the mainnet next year. We've already built on the testnet these decentralized applications which start trading this and you can use for these things. And then everything will launch next year, 2020, along with the Incoterms 2020.
Right.
So just to come back to tie that together, our hope is that small to medium-sized businesses are the first to onboard next year, as opposed to be, 10 years later after, multinationals have, used it to their benefit.
Right. You are going to be able to capture, I think there is an opportunity to capture the more tech-savvy SMEs, who would be able to understand the benefits much more easily than others. There is a certain perception around blockchain as a nascent technology of whether or not it's ready for something like this. What would you say to people who are a little bit hesitant on what this can offer to them and basically trying to convince them to make the leap?
Yeah, so first thing I'd say would be the big companies that have 100 plus staff doing admin work, matching bills of lading, letter of credits, all of these documents.
Right.
They're doing it. Like whether or not you're a naysayer or not, the unstoppable tide of change is here. They absolutely see the benefit. The Singapore government, which is an extremely pragmatic and prudent government, would not be investing huge amounts of money in this if they did not see the benefit for this. So first of all, the cat is out of the bag. There absolutely are, like the blockchain division within IBM has been pumping out a huge number of pilots. So this is already happening. The second thing would be, is the savings in terms of like a small to medium-sized business is sufficient for them to get deep on it? Probably not yet. So, when you think about the compression of adoption, so what happened is, when the telephone first came out, it took them 50 years for it to go to 50 million telephones. But then obviously once the nodes and the network effect became sufficient, everyone had a telephone. Whereas, something like Pokemon Go, it had 50 million adopted people like using it in 19 days. That was an interesting data point just because there were already so many phones in the wild. It was a very easy onboarding process, and so it got adopted. So the point that I was making from that example is we see this as a technology network that still needs time to build. So think about it like this. At a national level, if Singapore, Australia, China, Dubai, Middle East, UAE, some of these countries are all using, Rotterdam is leading with the Netherlands. So if all these countries start using a blockchain, which allows for them to seamlessly trade and it cuts their cost of operation, then there is pressure, social pressure for Indonesia and India and the US to start shifting from paper, to digital. So that's a project that we're looking at about how do you hybridize and interoperate digital and paper. But that's step one. Then level two is if Nike or Walmart or some of these big suppliers all use digital, and that you can get paid instantly if you switch from a paper invoicing methodology to their blockchain platform, of course you're going to do it, especially if you've got significant, operating costs or cost of capital because you're a small manufacturer and instead of being paid in 90 days or 120 days, you get instant payment. Of course you're going to do that. So there are all of these ripple effects. And actually we think that the biggest, and I'm not going to say losers, but people who are going to be disintermediated and will have to change their business model will be banks. Because right now, if you've got a letter of credit for a cargo of soybean from Brazil to China and it's open for 28 days, easy money, right? But what happens when that actually is no longer needed? and there's instant settlement. So there's going to be some interesting, I think, transitions for banks in their business model. But coming back to your key question around, when will people adopt it and how will adoption increase? Adoption's already happening. It's still clunky right now, but the rails which are being built, you can already see. It's like the people who laid, fiber under the oceans. They can see the adoption of mobile phones. They can see the data increase in terms of consumption. So they know the investment is going to make sense.
Right.
And that's what the governments and the big MNCs and ourselves, we see that we're laying down the fiber. And then once we start getting that tipping point of adoption, it just is going to be either countries that are going to force adoption or big consumers or big customers forcing suppliers to use it or offering incentives of use.
Yeah, and I think this generation and the future generations as well are going to be focusing on convenience. So I think that's going to be a huge factor as well as making things easier.
Yeah, but to your point, I mean, I don't think blockchain is going to be something which necessarily needs to be talked about. It's kind of like back in the day, people would talk about cable TV. You don't talk about cable TV.
Right.
You don't talk about VOD, video on demand. It's just Netflix. Like if you ask children today, like, what do you think of digital TV? They'll look at you funny. They're just like, what are you talking about? I just watch TV on my mobile, my laptop, my this, my that. Like it just is something that becomes ingrained. And so I think blockchain in the next 5 years will cease to be a term. It'll just be, this is decentralized.
Right.
Correct. Yeah. The consensus mechanism is decentralized as opposed to having, one government determine stuff.
Right. Now, I think whatever is front-facing is going to be on the public side for sure. I think some people who are going to be talking about the blockchain side, though, is going to be the regulators. How are regulators taking a look at what you guys are building, and you in the more general sense?
Sure. No. Look, I mean, but this is the scary part. Citizens of the world, look at what's happening in Hong Kong. Whether or not you are a pro-democracy, pro-free speech person versus if you sit on the more authoritarian, putting security ahead of dissidents. Whichever way you want to look at it, the future of democracy or, the future of governance is what really you have to decide on. And, coming back to your question, regulators in self-interest, government is meant to be for the people, by the people, of the people, not government sits above the people.
Right.
So the question really comes down to like, can this framework of regulators deciding? So let me ask you a question. Point blank, Thomas. If you could send money via Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp, would that be good for you?
Yes.
Convenience-wise, as a consumer, yes.
Of course.
So then why would the regulators put their interests of maintaining the US currency as a dominant global benchmark? Obviously, we don't want to live. It's a weird world where they can't print money to support their armies and to support their infrastructure. Good or bad, who knows? But these are the questions that I think regulators are having to grapple with much faster. I mean, I'll give you a much simpler example. Uber or Grab Taxi or Gojek or any of these apps that use car sharing, ride sharing, they're illegal. Because they don't have the taxi licenses that are regulated by the people. But they can't unwind them because the consumer usefulness is too great. Like if I can get a car instantly, and it can be whether it's a fellow citizen driving it or whether whoever it is, even though it contravenes law, it's like Airbnb. Airbnb is illegal. They don't have the licenses to operate. But in most cities, they're legal. Like actually, Singapore is one of the places where they've made it illegal. But it just comes back to convenience of the voter or the population versus the real or not real fears of the regulator. And right now, we are at exactly that place where regulators will be determining are the benefits of this decentralized economy sufficient enough for them to overcome the fears, real or imagined, that they have, which will show that decentralized technologies could disrupt their current way of operation. And so when you look at Congress trying to shut down Facebook's Libra, The big difference, I think, with trade is that the benefits are so significant and there's no downside. Like, we're not threatening any sovereign powers. The sovereign governments can still keep their data on their own ledger in their own country. That's the whole purpose. So they have their own private ledger with all their own data, and then it's just audited by the ICC internationally. Secondly, I think that they can still maintain their sovereign control over their borders with customs and, the bills of lading, letters of credit, certificates of origin, all being originated on ground and then, used and shipped internationally. So I think that trade is a far, far, far more digestible application where regulators should just be 1000% supportive of it. And you're seeing that. Like, there's never been talk of let's bar, smart incos because it's only a benefit. Indeed, that's why governments are funding it actively. But I don't see, governments funding Bitcoin or funding, Libra, because it is perceived as one of their key tools in their toolbox, e.g. monetary policy, that they would never give up.
Right.
So I think that, coming back to your question, I think regulators in our context will be very supportive, but on a wider context, it's a very, very. I think that currently there's a battle for the soul of democracy. Is government for the people, by the people, of the people, or is government on top of the people? Because that's what's being debated.
Right. Wow. Okay. Well,
Well, I think it's really relevant. Like, if you look at, say, from my passion on the environmental side, yes, the people elected in, Bolsonaro in Brazil, but does that give him the rights to ramp up deforestation and fires in the Amazon, where it's seen a hundreds of % increase just since he's come into government, where you've got the people electing, a Trump government or electing for Brexit, but is that may be the voice of the people. So there are plenty of examples where people are making the wrong choices from another perspective, but is it, is this the way that government should be run? Or are these the questions where regulators say, well, actually, the people do not understand fully, so therefore they should have no free speech.
Right.
And therefore we should install, our own government in, e.g. Hong Kong, and therefore we should have extradition laws. It's all of the, how far does the envelope get pushed?
Right.
Yeah, but I think I know that we've drifted into.
No, I mean, it's interesting. It does provide context for what drives the technology forward as well.
Yeah, but I think that that's actually the heart of where decentralized and cryptocurrency came from.
Absolutely. I mean, that's where Bitcoin came from, is to try and create something that's completely independent. So its roots are political.
Exactly. I mean, and if you think about how it was conceived, and this is to every listener of this podcast, the Bitcoin white paper was circulated after the GFC. So after the bailouts of the rich, where no single CEO of a Wall Street bank went to jail, and they used Main Street taxpayer money to bail out the rich, which subsequently a year later were making huge profits and paying out huge bonuses. That was when, in that climate, the Bitcoin white paper came out saying, why the hell do we have this system? Why can't we have a monetary system that does not rely on a central bank and does not give bailouts? And that's kind of where the genesis of the cypherpunks and the Bitcoinists kind of came from. Then this, and actually, even though people often will shake their head and go, oh, these Bitcoin people, actually, when you read the history of it, you can kind of understand, like, wow, why did we pay trillions of dollars to bail out rich people? Then the second part about it is privacy. So the big element around, cybersecurity, cryptocurrency, encryption, whose data, should be visible, should not be visible, should you be able to control and own your own data? These are the questions that I think the security element or the cybersecurity element and the privacy element of cryptocurrency. Should the government know who has money? And so right now, government with their AML KYC, they want full transparency. Whereas a lot of people want to have the right to have private transactions and private money. And then it always comes down to, is it the public good or is it the private right?
No, that makes sense. There are a few other topics that I think maybe merit their own conversation when it comes to how this would impact trade-related, but not necessarily trade topics such as the insurance, a little bit more on the regulation when it comes to privacy and also taxation. But maybe what we can do now is we'll leave that aside, and instead we'll focus on the tools that Perlin is offering the industry now. You're working on a variety of different tools. Many of them, or most of them, are open source, you mentioned. So what makes WebAssembly, the smart contract WebAssembly, and Wavelet ledgers special?
So first of all, so they're what I'd call layer one. So
Okay.
they're just the tools that we've built that people can then work with. But basically, you can start doing your own smart contracts. You can start playing around and building applications on top of Wavelet. So it's a very user-friendly blockchain that's very fast and very democratic. That's just the characteristics of it. The second part is, so tool number one that we've built, if any company out there wants to show provenance of their supply chain, come talk to us. So whether it's showing that, the rayon or the viscose came from certified wood supply, whether it's showing that the coconut copra came from a smallholder, whether or not it's showing that there was no environmental damage, in this particular supply chain, come talk to us. And that's called Clarify. So it's just an application to show supply chain traceability, clarifying. Then the second part is authenticity. So we've been working with QR codes and the blockchain to show. So actually, we spoke to a Chamber of Commerce from Australia, and for Italy, Australia made is a big thing. But is it sometimes subverted because it'll be exported to another country, diluted, mixed up, and still call Australian made? So, should that type of certification be on the blockchain? So after Clarify, we had Certify. And then the next one that we worked on was really looking at the smart Incos. So the smart Incos, again, are Incoterms, but self-executing. Again, we think that the adoption of these are still many years in the future. But just to show Incoterms 2020 have been reimagined, we believe that Incoterms, if they were to be reinvented for 2020, should absolutely have some smart contract elements to them. Then the next part is the ledger of ledgers. So this is where the public-ledger.org, which we're working with the ICC on, that's the ledger that publicly can audit or provide confidence that the private ledgers have not been changed or amended. That's the next tool. So again, if anyone out there listening to this podcast has any issues around authenticity, that their brand is authentic, or what they're exporting is really from that country, that's Certify. If anyone out there is looking at trade and wants to play around with our, so we've created a digital contract, sales contract based on the ICC template, customizable fields, and then that can have plug-in API for different sensors, and that's the Smart Incos piece. And then also, if anyone out there is already running their own blockchain. So if, for example, so I met with Hamad, who's the head of the Dubai Chamber of Commerce, and they're doing their own blockchain deployment for Dubai. So, that would be an example where we could, for example, have the ICC work with their ledger. So these are all the different tools. The last one I think of note that's worth mentioning, we're calling Hybrid X. And that's really for countries and companies which still will use paper. All we've done is we've said, look, full digital chain of custody and full digital paper trail is still many years away. So how do we work with the ICC and Chambers of Commerce that they could be trusted agents to change from paper to digital? So you can have, for example, a shredder scanner. So it shreds the original, scans it, and then certifies that that's the only digital copy. And then that digital copy can still be used in the trade platform. So it's really looking at what we call Hybrid X, and that's really for big trading houses that go from potentially a developing country to a technologically developed country. You can have the hybrid paper and digital interface.
Especially in that transitory period.
Exactly. Right. And so the most important thing is that can we get bums on seats and deals on digital ASAP, even if they do go in between to paper.
As a sort of closing statement, what are your biggest hopes for the industry?
Look, I think at the end of the day, I'll start with my environmental hat.
Yeah.
Robert F. Kennedy said, never forget that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. So I think, having young children, I really hope that trade becomes both fair, because you can't have vast wealth gaps and not have immigration, conflict, disruption. Secondly, I was going to say that I think, so tying into that, we've got to have some sustainability measures, making sure that we don't ruin the global commons. And that's one of the one of the side projects that we're working on is called Global Ledger. And that all that is can you track companies on the blockchain? So, for example, if people are claiming to source sustainable goods, how do you do that on the blockchain so it's all publicly very visible? The example we used in that case was, VW, if it wanted to gain public trust again after the Dieselgate, where they were claiming to have clean diesel but didn't, they should just put IoT into like an Internet of Things device into all cars, and then capture the emission data just to show that actually there is reductions in emissions, and put it on a blockchain. Because right now the problem there was the central authority, VW, was claiming that it was doing the right thing, but the external auditor was corrupt and was going along with the falsehood. So at least on a public blockchain, you couldn't do that.
Right.
So you'd have to publish the real data unless they could game it across 1 million cars, which is much harder. So just coming back, I think 3 hopes. Hope 1, environmentally, we are more able to integrate into smart contracts and this type of sensor-based monitoring and using the blockchain. Secondly, democratization, like can trade be truly much more easy, efficient, and democratized? And thirdly, I think, we always have to keep a line of sight in terms of where our governments and governance is going. And you're going to see a reshaping of the world economy. Sometimes it's a pendulum. But when you think about, like I said, peak centralization, when you had really strong multilateral, like the UN almost got everything over the line. I think the Obama administration was really the peak of that. Then you look at the Trump administration, you look at Brexit, it's really swung to where you've got hugely fragmented sovereign interests. And that's really scary because we have only one globe. So how is it going to be that we're shuffling, deck chairs on the Titanic and ego and interests? Because I can't see us really being able to navigate global problems, whether it's migration, poverty, and climate change as effectively, as a sovereign state. So underpinning all of that is the march of technology. So how do we deploy technology intelligently without causing, significant disruption to the way that we've enjoyed life for the last, since the last major conflict. So my concerns really are, how do we keep ourselves on the same, level of civilization without taking steps backward because some of these major changes.
I think you found a right partner with ICC.
I do too. No, I genuinely do. I think the last point I'd make actually is a huge thank you to John Denton and his whole team at the Secretary General's office and the ICC and ICC Academy, Daniel, yourself. I just think that the ICC is one of the most enlightened multilateral organizations that's really keen to lead, and in the absence of leadership, because most multilateral organizations have to play second fiddle to their sovereign members. They're actually beholden to some of this conflict at the sovereign level, whereas the ICC is not afraid of sticking their neck out there and driving change. So kudos to everyone involved, and we are very, very proud supporters of the ICC.
Same with us when it comes to working with Perlin.net. And thank you again so much for coming in.
Anytime, Thomas. Thank you.
We're looking forward to doing part 2 together.
Anytime. We'll talk. We'll have to have whiskey and cigars and talk more about the philosophy of leadership and governance.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you again. As a reminder, we are hosting live broadcasts every month, so sign up on our website for free and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And ladies and gentlemen, this has been another episode of the ICC Livecast. See you next time.